"I stand before you tonight," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "not as a man who has all the answers, but as someone who is learning to trust God even in the darkest valley." Ruth would want us to celebrate the birth of our Savior, not mourn her absence. She would want us to remember that even when we cannot understand God's plan, we can trust His heart. The congregation wept openly as Daniel spoke about faith in the midst of uncertainty, about hope that persists, even when earthly circumstances seem hopeless. He quoted from Ruth's favorite passage in Isaiah, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." After the service, Elder Thompson approached Daniel with tears in his eyes. "Pastor, how do you continue to trust God after something like this?" Daniel's answer would be quoted in Cedar Falls for years to come. "Because, Tom, if I stop trusting God now, then Ruth's faith meant nothing, and I know her faith meant everything." In the months following Ruth's disappearance, Pastor Daniel Morrison faced the most challenging period of his ministry and his life. Well-meaning members of his congregation suggested he take a leave of absence, perhaps move to a different town where the memories wouldn't be so overwhelming. But Daniel felt called to stay at Grace Community Church, believing that God had placed him there for a purpose he didn't yet understand. The parsonage felt enormous and empty without Ruth's presence. Every morning, Daniel would wake expecting to hear her humming in the kitchen, only to be greeted by silence. He kept her coffee cup in the cabinet, unwashed since that last Tuesday morning, unable to bring himself to put it away permanently. Her Bible remained on her nightstand, bookmarked at Psalm 139, a passage about God knowing every detail of our lives, even the number of our days. As 1976 began, Daniel threw himself into his pastoral duties with renewed intensity. He visited the sick more frequently, spent longer hours in prayer and study, and preached with a passion that many described as both beautiful and heartbreaking. His sermons during this period focused heavily on themes of trust during suffering, the mystery of God's plan, and the hope of eternal reunion. "Pastor Morrison's faith during this trial has strengthened all of us," Martha Stevens wrote in a letter to her sister. "He could have become bitter, could have questioned why God would allow such a thing to happen to a faithful servant. Instead, he's become even more compassionate, even more dedicated to helping others through their struggles." But despite his public strength, Daniel wrestled privately with profound questions. Late at night, alone in his study, he would pour out his heart in journals that he kept hidden in his desk drawer. The entries revealed the depth of his struggle. February 14th, 1976, another Valentine's Day without Ruth. The congregation was so thoughtful, they left flowers on my desk and cards expressing their love and support. But all I could think about was how Ruth would have spent today visiting the elderly members who don't have family nearby. She always said that love was meant to be shared, especially with those who felt forgotten. I went to Sunset Manor this afternoon and read to Mrs. Whitman. She asked about Ruth again. I told her Ruth was with Jesus now, though I don't know if that's true. I don't know anything anymore. March 22nd, 1976. Found Ruth's gardening gloves in the garage today while looking for a wrench to fix the leaky faucet. She was so excited about planting roses this spring. The catalogue is still on the kitchen counter, with the varieties she circled in red ink. I can't bring myself to throw it away. God, if you can hear me, please give me some sign about what happened to her. This, not knowing, is the hardest part. April 10th, 1976, Easter morning. Preached about resurrection and hope, while my own heart feels buried in a tomb that has no promise of rolling away. Elder Thompson asked me again about taking some time away from ministry. I told him no, but I'm beginning to wonder if my presence here is helping or hindering the congregation's healing. How can I lead others to hope when I'm struggling to find it myself? The investigations continued sporadically through 1976 and 1977, but with each passing month, the case grew colder. Detective Hayes, who had become personally invested in finding answers for Daniel, reviewed the file regularly and followed up on occasional tips that came in. But every lead led to a dead end. "We've interviewed over 300 people," she told Daniel during one of their regular check-ins in the spring of 1977. "We've searched a 50-mile radius around Cedar Falls. We've contacted law enforcement agencies in 6 surrounding states. I want you to know that we haven't given up, Pastor Morrison, but I also want to be honest with you about the likelihood of finding new information at this point." Daniel nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I appreciate your honesty. Detective Hayes, I know you've done everything possible. I've been praying about this, and I'm beginning to feel that God may be calling me to accept that I may never know what happened to Ruth in this life. That doesn't mean I'll stop hoping, but it means I need to learn to live with the questions." The conversation marked a turning point in Daniel's grief journey. Rather than becoming more withdrawn, he began to counsel other families dealing with loss and uncertainty. His experience with unanswered questions gave him a unique ability to comfort those who were struggling with their own inexplicable tragedies. By 1978, Daniel had established a support group at Grace Community Church for families dealing with missing loved ones. The group met monthly and drew members from throughout the Cedar Falls area. Daniel's leadership in this ministry became legendary in the region as he helped dozens of families navigate the complex emotions of living with uncertainty. "Pastor Morrison has this incredible gift," said Janet Wheeler, whose teenage son had disappeared in 1977. "He doesn't try to give you easy answers or tell you that everything happens for a reason. Instead, he sits with you in the pain and helps. You find God even in the darkness. He's living proof that faith and doubt can coexist, that you can trust God even when you don't understand Him." As the years passed, Daniel's ministry at Grace Community Church grew significantly. The congregation, which had numbered about 150 members when Ruth disappeared, grew to over 400 by 1980. People came from neighboring towns specifically to hear Pastor Morrison preach, drawn by his authentic wrestling with faith and his refusal to offer superficial comfort. Daniel remarried in 1983 to Sarah Coleman, a widow who had been part of his support group after her husband died in a farming accident. Their courtship was careful and respectful, with Daniel being transparent about his continuing love for Ruth's memory. Sarah understood that she wasn't replacing Ruth, but rather joining her life to a man who had learned to love deeply, despite the risk of loss. "I'm not asking you to forget Ruth," Sarah told Daniel the night he proposed. "I'm asking you to let me walk alongside you as you continue to honor her memory while building a new life. I've watched you help so many people heal from their losses. Let me help you heal from yours." Their marriage was a source of great joy for the Grace Community congregation, who had watched Daniel carry his grief with grace for 8 years. The wedding ceremony included a moment of remembrance for Ruth, with Daniel placing a white rose on the altar and saying, "Ruth taught me how to love sacrificially." In the quiet town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, the year 1975 would forever be etched in the memory of Grace Community Church. It was the year Pastor Daniel Morrison's beloved wife, Ruth, vanished without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt the congregation for 3 decades. But in 2005, during a routine renovation of the old church building, workers would make a discovery that would finally reveal the shocking truth about what happened to Ruth Morrison and expose a web of deceit that had been carefully concealed within the very walls of God's house. The morning of October 15, 1975, began like any other Tuesday in Cedar Falls. Pastor Daniel Morrison, a gentleman of 42 with graying temples and kind eyes, prepared for his weekly sermon preparation in his study. The autumn air carried The scent of burning leaves through the windows of the modest parsonage that sat adjacent to Grace Community Church, where Daniel had served faithfully for 8 years. Ruth Morrison, his wife of 15 years, hummed softly as she prepared breakfast in their small kitchen. At 38, Ruth was known throughout the community for her warm smile, her dedication to the church's children's ministry, and her unwavering faith. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she moved gracefully between the stove and the table, setting out plates for their simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. "Daniel, breakfast is ready," she called out, her voice carrying the melodic tone that had first captured his heart when they met at seminary. Daniel emerged from his study, his reading glasses perched on his nose, carrying his worn leather Bible and a notebook filled with sermon ideas. "Smells wonderful, darling," he said, kissing her cheek as he took his seat at the small wooden table. Ruth poured coffee into 2 mismatched cups, a wedding gift from his aunt that had somehow survived their many moves during Daniel's early ministry years. As they ate, Ruth mentioned her plans for the day. "I'm meeting with Martha Stevens this afternoon about the Christmas pageant," she said, buttering her toast. "The children are so excited to start practicing, even though it's still October. And Mrs. Henderson called last night. She wants me to visit her mother at the nursing home. The poor woman has been asking for prayer." Daniel nodded, admiring his wife's compassionate heart. Ruth had always been the perfect pastor's wife, not because she was forced into the role, but because she genuinely loved serving others. She organized food drives for struggling families, taught Sunday school to the youngest children, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to comfort those who were grieving. "Don't forget, we have the board meeting tonight," Daniel reminded. "Elder Thompson wants to discuss the budget for next year's missions trip." Ruth's expression flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Daniel almost missed it. But he had been married to her long enough to notice the subtle signs when something was troubling her. "Is everything all right, Ruth?" She smiled. But it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, dear. I'm just tired. I haven't been sleeping well lately." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I love you, Daniel. Never forget that. No matter what happens." The words struck him as oddly intense for a typical Tuesday morning conversation, but before he could ask what she meant, the telephone rang. Daniel answered it. A parishioner needed him to visit the hospital immediately. Their conversation was cut short as he gathered his things and hurried out the door, leaving Ruth standing in the kitchen doorway, watching him go with an expression he would later remember as profoundly sad. That was the last time anyone saw Ruth Morrison alive. When Daniel returned home that evening, he expected to find Ruth preparing dinner and asking about his day. Instead, he found an empty house. The breakfast dishes were still on the table, exactly where they had left them that morning. Ruth's purse sat on the counter, her car keys beside it. Her coat hung on the hook by the door. At first, Daniel wasn't alarmed. Perhaps Ruth had walked to the church to prepare for the evening board meeting, or maybe she was visiting a neighbor. But as the hours passed and Ruth failed to appear for the board meeting, something she had never missed in their 8 years at Grace Community, Daniel began to worry. He called the police at 10:30 that night, after searching the church building, the neighborhood, and calling every member of their congregation. The investigating officers, Sergeant Michael Clark and Detective Linda Hayes, took the report seriously, despite the short time frame. Ruth Morrison was known throughout Cedar Falls as a reliable, responsible woman who would never simply disappear without explanation. "Has your wife been acting strangely lately?" Detective Hayes asked, as she sat in the Morrisons' small living room, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Any changes in behavior, mood, or routine?" Daniel struggled to remember any warning signs. "She mentioned she hadn't been sleeping well," he said slowly, "and this morning she said something that seemed intense. She told me she loved me and to never forget that, no matter what happens." At the time, I thought it was just Ruth being affectionate, but now, any marital problems? Sergeant Clark asked gently. Financial difficulties? Threats from anyone in the community? None, Daniel said firmly. Ruth and I were happy. We've had our struggles. Every couple does. But we were committed to each other and to our ministry here. As for finances, we live simply, but we're not in any trouble. And threats? He shook his head. Everyone loved Ruth. She was involved in every charity in town, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, visited the elderly. I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. The initial investigation revealed few clues. Ruth had indeed visited Mrs. Henderson's mother at Sunset Manor Nursing Home that afternoon, arriving at 2 p.m. and leaving at 3:30 p.m. The nursing staff remembered her as being her usual cheerful self, though one nurse mentioned that Ruth had spent an unusually long time praying with the elderly woman. She stayed by Mrs. Whitman's bedside for almost an hour, Nurse Patricia Coleman told the investigators. I heard her reading scripture, Psalm 23, I think, and she was holding the old woman's hand. It was very touching, but Ruth always was especially gentle with our residents. After leaving the nursing home, Ruth's movements became uncertain. A few townspeople reported seeing a woman matching her description walking near the town square around 4 p.m., but no one could be certain it was Ruth. The trail went cold after that. As days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded. Police searched the nearby woods, dragged the Cedar River, and interviewed hundreds of residents. They discovered that Ruth had withdrawn $300 from their savings account 2 days before her disappearance, a significant sum for a pastor's family in 1975, but not enough to suggest she was planning to start a new life elsewhere. The Cedar Falls community rallied around Pastor Morrison with unprecedented support. Members of Grace Community Church organized search parties that combed every inch of the surrounding countryside. Other local churches temporarily suspended their own activities to help with the search efforts. The local newspaper, the Cedar Falls Gazette, ran Ruth's photograph on the front page for 3 consecutive weeks. But as autumn turned to winter, hope began to fade. The police had exhausted every lead, and the search parties found nothing but empty fields and bare trees. On Christmas Eve, exactly 70 days after Ruth's disappearance, Pastor Morrison stood before his congregation and delivered what many would later remember as the most heartbreaking sermon they had ever heard. That love didn't die with her. It prepared my heart to love again. Daniel and Sarah had 2 children together, Rebecca, born in 1985, and Matthew, born in 1987. As Daniel held his newborn daughter for the first time, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected blessings that had emerged from his deepest pain. He often told Rebecca and Matthew stories about Ruth, making sure they understood that she was a part of their family's history, even though they had never met her. The 1980s and 1990s brought stability and growth to Daniel's ministry. He wrote several books about faith during difficult seasons, with titles like Trusting God in the Dark and When Heaven is Silent. His books sold modestly but had a profound impact on readers who were struggling with their own questions about God's goodness in the face of suffering. But despite the blessings of his second marriage and the growth of his ministry, Daniel never stopped wondering about Ruth. On the anniversary of her disappearance each year, he would spend time alone in prayer, asking God to watch over her soul and to comfort any family members who might still be wondering what happened to their loved one. I don't think the questions will ever completely go away, he wrote in his journal on the 20th anniversary of Ruth's disappearance. But I've learned that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does have the answers, even when he chooses not to share them with us. Ruth's disappearance was a tragedy, but it wasn't the end of her story, or mine. God has woven even this broken thread into something beautiful. As the year 2005 approached, Daniel Morrison had served Grace Community Church for 30 years. The congregation was planning a celebration of his ministry, complete with testimonials from the hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. But none of them could have imagined that God was preparing to answer a prayer that had been whispered in the darkness for 30 years. By the spring of 2005, Grace Community Church had outgrown its original building. What had started as a modest congregation of 150 members in 1975 had flourished under Pastor Daniel Morrison's leadership into a thriving community of over 800 active members. The church board, led by the now elderly Tom Thompson, who had served as an elder for nearly 3 decades, made the difficult decision to renovate the sanctuary and add a new fellowship hall. The renovation project began in April 2005 with Morrison Construction, a local company owned by David Morrison, one of Daniel's cousins, handling the work. The irony of the shared last name wasn't lost on the congregation, who saw it as yet another example of God's providence in their pastor's life. It feels right that a Morrison is helping restore the place where Pastor Morrison has served so faithfully, observed Margaret Stevens, Martha's daughter, who had taken over many of her mother's responsibilities in the church after Martha's death. In 1999, the original sanctuary had been built in 1923, and subsequent additions over the decades had created an unusual layout with several awkward alcoves and spaces. The renovation plan called for removing some interior walls to create a more open worship space and better sightlines to the pulpit. David Morrison and his crew began work on a Monday morning in early May, starting with the removal of what appeared to be a decorative wall panel behind the choir loft. The wall had been installed sometime in the 1970s, according to church records, as part of a minor renovation project completed in late 1975. "This wall isn't load-bearing," David explained to Pastor Morrison as they surveyed the work site. "It looks like it was added to cover some old electrical work, or maybe to improve the acoustics behind the choir. We'll have it down by the end of the day." Daniel watched with interest as the crew carefully removed the wood paneling. After 30 years of ministry in this building, he was curious to see what lay behind walls he had looked at thousands of times during sermons and services. As the workers pulled away the final section of paneling, they revealed a small cavity between the decorative wall and the original church wall, a space about 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, and 18 inches deep. It was David Morrison's nephew, Tommy, a 19-year-old summer worker, who made the discovery that would change everything. As he reached into the cavity to clear out debris and old insulation, his hand touched something unexpected. "Uncle Dave!" Tommy called out, his voice carrying a strange note of excitement and confusion. "There's something back here, something wrapped in plastic." David Morrison climbed up on the scaffolding to look for himself. In the beam of his flashlight, he could see what appeared to be a carefully wrapped bundle tucked into the furthest corner of the cavity, almost invisible unless someone was specifically looking for it. "Let's get Pastor Morrison over here," David said quietly, something in his tone alerting the other workers that this was more than routine construction debris. Daniel approached the scaffolding with curiosity rather than alarm. In his experience, old buildings often yielded interesting artifacts during renovation. Forgotten time capsules, old photographs, even occasionally valuable items that had been stored and forgotten. "What did you find, David?" Daniel asked as he climbed up to peer into the cavity. David handed him the flashlight and pointed to the bundle. "Take a look, Pastor. Tommy found this tucked way back in the corner. It's been wrapped carefully in what looks like plastic sheeting. This isn't something that fell back there by accident." Daniel directed the flashlight beam toward the bundle, and his heart began to race as he took in the details. The plastic wrapping was old but intact, and through the translucent material he could make out what appeared to be fabric, possibly clothing, and the unmistakable shape of a book. "Can we get it out?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Absolutely," David replied. "Tommy, can you reach it from where you are?" Tommy carefully extracted the bundle from its hiding place, noting its surprising weight. "It's heavier than it looks," he said, as he handed it down to Pastor Morrison. "And it feels like there might be more than just clothes and a book in here." Daniel held the bundle with trembling hands, his mind racing with possibilities. The plastic wrapping was secured with tape that had yellowed with age, and through the material he could see what looked like fabric in a floral pattern that seemed hauntingly familiar. "Should we open it here?" David asked, noting the pale expression on his cousin's face. "Let's take it to my office," Daniel replied quietly. "And David, I think we should call the police before we unwrap this. I have a feeling about what this might be." Word spread quickly through the church building that the renovation crew had found something significant. Sarah Morrison arrived within minutes, followed by several of the church staff and a few members who happened to be at the church for various meetings. By the time Detective Linda Hayes arrived, now a lieutenant after 30 years with the Cedar Falls Police Department, a small crowd had gathered in Daniel's office. "Pastor Morrison," Lieutenant Hayes said as she entered the office, her expression serious but kind. "I have to say, when I got the call that something had been found at Grace Community Church, my first thought was of Ruth. Is that what this is about?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak as he gestured toward the bundle on his desk. Hayes examined the package carefully, noting the age of the plastic and tape, the way it had been wrapped with obvious care and intention. "This has been hidden deliberately," she observed. "The way it's wrapped, the location where it was found. Someone put this there on purpose and expected it to stay hidden." She looked at Daniel with compassion. "Are you prepared for what we might find inside?" "I've been preparing for 30 years," Daniel replied quietly. "Whatever this contains, I need to know." With Daniel and Sarah's permission, Lieutenant Hayes carefully cut through the old tape and began unwrapping the bundle. As the plastic fell away, gasps echoed through the office. Inside was a woman's dress in a floral pattern, neatly folded, but clearly stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Beneath the dress was a small leather purse, and beneath that a well-worn Bible with Ruth Morrison embossed in gold letters on the cover. Sarah Morrison reached for her husband's hand as Daniel stared at the items that had belonged to his first wife. The Bible was the one Ruth had carried to church every Sunday, the one she had used for her personal devotions, the one that contained 38 years' worth of underlining margin notes and pressed flowers from their anniversary bouquets. "Daniel," Lieutenant Hayes said gently, "I need to ask you to identify these items officially. Is this your first wife's Bible?" Daniel picked up the Bible with reverent hands, opening it to the front page where Ruth had written her name in her distinctive handwriting. Below her name, in the same careful script, was a date, October 15th, 1975, and a short message. "If anyone finds this, please know that I forgive those who have hurt me. My hope is in the Lord. Ruth Morrison." The silence in the room was profound as everyone absorbed the implications of what they had just discovered. Ruth Morrison had written this message on the day she disappeared, apparently knowing that something was going to happen to her. More shocking still was the realization that her belongings had been hidden in the church where her husband had preached for 30 years, hidden behind a wall that had been installed just weeks after her disappearance. Lieutenant Hayes immediately called for additional investigators and the county coroner. Within hours, Grace Community Church was transformed into a crime scene, with yellow tape cordoning off the sanctuary and forensics teams carefully examining every inch of the cavity where Ruth's belongings had been found. As investigators worked, Daniel sat in his office with Sarah, holding Ruth's Bible and struggling to process the magnitude of what had been discovered. The message Ruth had written suggested she had known she was in danger, but from whom, and how had her belongings ended up hidden in the church wall? "The dress will need to be tested for DNA evidence," Lieutenant Hayes explained to Daniel as the investigation continued. "The bloodstains suggest that Ruth was injured, possibly fatally. We'll also be looking for any other physical evidence that might tell us what happened to her." "But how did her things get into that wall?" Sarah asked the question that everyone was thinking. "And why would someone hide them in the church?" Lieutenant Hayes studied the church building plans that had been retrieved from the city planning office. According to these records, the wall where we found Ruth's belongings was installed on November 3rd, 1975, less than 3 weeks after she disappeared. The work was done by Henderson Construction, and the project was approved by the church. Aboard! Daniel's blood ran cold as he remembered the name. Henderson Construction, that was run by Bill Henderson, whose mother Ruth was visiting the day she disappeared. Mrs. Henderson's mother at the nursing home. The investigation was taking a dramatic turn, and Daniel found himself not only grieving the confirmation of his wife's death, but also confronting the possibility that someone in his congregation, someone he had trusted and served alongside for 30 years, might have been responsible for Ruth's murder. As night fell on that shocking day in May 2005, Daniel Morrison knelt in his study and opened Ruth's Bible to Psalm 139, the passage she had been reading the morning she disappeared. His eyes fell on a verse that Ruth had underlined in red ink. "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." In the margin beside the verse, Ruth had written a note. "God sees everything, even what is hidden in darkness. Truth will come to light." 30 years after her disappearance, Ruth Morrison's faith was proving prophetic. The forensic analysis of Ruth Morrison's belongings moved swiftly in the days following their discovery. Modern DNA testing, which hadn't been available in 1975, quickly confirmed that the blood on Ruth's dress belonged to her. More disturbing still, the pattern of bloodstains and the amount of blood present suggested that Ruth had suffered significant trauma before her death. Lieutenant Hayes worked around the clock to piece together the events of October 15, 1975, using the new evidence combined with witness statements from the original investigation. The connection to Henderson Construction proved to be the key that unlocked 30 years of secrets. Bill Henderson had been 62 years old in 1975, a respected member of the Cedar Falls community and a longtime member of Grace Community Church. His construction company had done renovation work for several local churches, and he was known for his craftsmanship and fair pricing. But as investigators dug deeper into Henderson's background, disturbing patterns began to emerge. "We've been reviewing financial records from 1975, Detective James Wilson, Hayes's partner, reported to Daniel during a meeting at the police station. Henderson Construction was in serious financial trouble that year. Bill Henderson had borrowed heavily to expand his business, and several major projects had fallen through. He was facing bankruptcy and possibly losing his family home. The investigation revealed that Henderson had been systematically overcharging clients and using inferior materials to cut costs. When Grace Community Church hired him to do minor acoustic improvements to the sanctuary in late 1975, he saw an opportunity to cover his tracks while solving a more immediate problem. "We believe Henderson killed your wife during her visit to see his mother at the nursing home," Lieutenant Hayes explained to Daniel and Sarah as they sat in the station's conference room. Ruth may have overheard something or witnessed something that would have exposed Henderson's financial fraud. Remember, she was there for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, much longer than a typical visit. The investigators had located Nurse Patricia Coleman, now 78 and living in Arizona. Despite the passage of 30 years, she clearly remembered Ruth Morrison's final visit to Sunset Manor. Mrs. Morrison was such a sweet lady, Coleman told investigators during a phone interview. That day, she spent her usual time with Mrs. Henderson's mother, but then she asked if she could visit some of the other residents who didn't get many visitors. I remember thinking it was so kind of her. Coleman's memory provided a crucial detail that had been overlooked in 1975. After Mrs. Morrison finished her visits, she was walking toward the exit when she passed by the administrator's office. The door was open, and she could hear raised voices inside. I remember because she stopped and looked concerned, the way she always did when someone seemed to be in distress. Further investigation revealed that Bill Henderson had been meeting with the nursing home administrator that afternoon, desperately trying to renegotiate payment terms for construction work he had done at the facility. Henderson owed significant money to suppliers and subcontractors, and the nursing home project was his last hope of avoiding bankruptcy. Ruth Morrison was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Detective Wilson concluded. She likely overheard Henderson discussing his financial crimes, specifically how he had been inflating invoices and using substandard materials. For someone as ethical as Ruth, hearing that information would have put her in an impossible position. The investigators theorized that Henderson had followed Ruth when she left the nursing home, possibly trying to convince her to keep quiet about what she had heard. When Ruth refused to remain silent about his fraudulent business practices, Henderson had killed her in a moment of desperation. But why hide her belongings in the church wall? Sarah asked during one of their briefings with the police. Because Henderson was scheduled to do the acoustic work at Grace Community just 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Hayes explained. He realized that hiding the evidence at the church would be the perfect cover. Who would ever think to look for Ruth Morrison's belongings in the walls of the building where her husband preached? And Henderson could control the narrative by being the contractor who installed the wall. The investigation revealed additional evidence that supported this theory. Church financial records from 1975 showed that Henderson had completed the acoustic work at Grace Community for significantly less than his original bid, an unusual practice for a contractor facing bankruptcy, unless he had other motivations for securing the job. More damning still, investigators discovered that Henderson had insisted on working alone during the installation of the wall panel, claiming that the acoustic work required special attention to detail. Church members who had been present during the renovation remembered Henderson working late into the evening, long after his usual crew had gone home. He told everyone he was a perfectionist, recalled Margaret Stevens, who had helped coordinate the church's renovation projects over the years. He said he wanted to make sure the acoustics were just right for Pastor Morrison's sermons. We all thought it was so thoughtful, especially since Pastor Morrison was going through such a difficult time with Ruth's disappearance. The cruel irony was devastating. Bill Henderson had hidden Ruth Morrison's blood-stained belongings behind a wall that her grieving husband would look at thousands of times over the next 30 years, never knowing that evidence of her murder was just feet away from where he stood each Sunday morning. The investigation into Henderson's whereabouts in 1975 revealed that he had left Cedar Falls abruptly in December of that year, claiming that his wife's health required a move to a warmer climate. The couple had relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, where Henderson had died of a heart attack in 1987. His wife, Catherine, had passed away in 1995, taking any potential knowledge of her husband's crimes to her grave. Even if Bill Henderson were still alive, we would face significant challenges in prosecuting this case, Lieutenant Hayes explained to Daniel. The physical evidence is strong, but proving murder after 30 years is always difficult. However, I want you to know that we are confident we've solved Ruth's case. The evidence clearly shows that she was killed by Bill Henderson, and her belongings were hidden by the same man who installed the wall where we found them. For Daniel Morrison, The revelation brought a complex mixture of relief, grief, and anger. Relief that he finally knew what had happened to Ruth, grief for the confirmation of her death, and anger that someone he had trusted and served alongside in ministry had been responsible for his wife's murder. "I remember Bill Henderson," Daniel told the investigators. "He was quiet during services, sat in the back with his wife. After Ruth disappeared, he was one of the people who offered to help with the search. He looked me in the eye and asked if there was anything he could do to help find her, knowing all along that he had killed her." The discovery also explained some details from 1975 that had puzzled investigators at the time. Ruth's withdrawal of $300 from their savings account, for instance, now seemed likely to have been for a charitable purpose, possibly to help someone in financial distress. Ruth was known for her generous spirit, and it was entirely consistent with her character that she would have offered to help someone who was struggling financially. Ruth probably offered to help Henderson when she learned about his financial troubles, Lieutenant Hayes speculated. She wouldn't have known about the fraudulent activities at first. She likely would have seen him as someone who needed compassion and support. That generosity may have saved Henderson temporarily, but it also put Ruth in danger when she later discovered the extent of his crimes. As the official investigation concluded, Daniel faced the difficult task of sharing the truth with his congregation and the broader Cedar Falls community. The news that Ruth Morrison had been murdered by a trusted church member sent shockwaves through the town, especially among the many people who had known and respected Bill Henderson. On the Sunday morning following the completion of the investigation, Daniel stood before his congregation holding Ruth's Bible, the same Bible that had been hidden in their church wall for 30 years. His sermon that morning, titled "Truth Hidden in Darkness Will Come to Light," was one of the most powerful messages many had ever heard. 30 years ago, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "I stood in this same spot and told you that even when we cannot understand God's plan, we can trust His heart. Today, I stand before you with proof that God's timing is perfect, even when it seems impossibly slow to our human understanding." He held up Ruth's Bible, showing the congregation the message she had written on the day she died. Ruth wrote, "My hope is in the Lord." Even facing death, even knowing that someone intended to harm her, Ruth's faith remained unshaken. "That faith has sustained me for 30 years, and it sustains me still." The congregation wept as Daniel shared the details of the investigation, the discovery of Ruth's belongings, and the evidence that Bill Henderson had been responsible for her death. But rather than focusing on anger or bitterness, Daniel's message emphasized forgiveness and the ultimate triumph of truth.